Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. This is episode 27. I am your host, Barney Smith of storycomic.com, and we're excited to have back with us the famed Vermont author and folklorist, Joseph Citro. Joseph. Joe,
Yes.
How you doing? So it's interesting. Last time we met, we talked a couple years ago. You were promoting your upcoming book that you're coming out with called the Vermont Ghost Guide.
Right.
That came out. Plus, since then, you've had the Vermont Ghost Experience come out.
Right.
Plus, you've also come out with, just recently, as of this recording, a couple months ago, the Loose Ends, which is your so it's 100 chapters of 100 words in each chapter. Is that how it went?
Right. This is a form that Jim DeFilippi pioneered. He's a friend of mine, and he has a publishing company called Brown Fedora Books. And he came up with this idea for writing autobiographies that would be exactly 100 chapters, and each chapter is exactly 100 words, not 100, not 102, not 98, exactly 100.
Wow.
Which is a bit challenging. And and this was my pandemic project.
Okay.
I couldn't really get out and do the research and meet the people and visit the sites that I needed to in order to do another book, another full-blown book. And although I'd always sort of entertained the idea of writing an autobiography, doing a full-blown autobiography would just be too much work. So this fit perfectly. I remember I first got interested in autobiographies, I think, when I was in about the 6th grade. And I ran across this quote by Benvenuto Cellini, the Italian sculptor. And he said he wrote a very famous autobiography in which he said something like, what did he say? That you had to be at least 40 years old and have done something of note to write an autobiography. So I figured that, in the 6th grade, I was sort of left out. I couldn't really tackle one, but the idea of it was always in the back of my mind. And I hit age 40 and zoomed well past it, but still hadn't done anything particularly notable. But then this pandemic came along, and Jim's challenge to write one of these autobiographies, and man, it was just the right thing at the right time. And I didn't really need to concern myself about how many people would be interested in it, because it was a writing exercise. It was a wonderful opportunity to sort of indulge in my own private history. Each 100-word chapter took a bit of crafting, not just to get the precise number of words, but to make every word work.
Right.
It was almost like, I don't write poetry, but it was the way I imagine poetry to be. That is a sequence of words, all of which has a specific assignment, and all of which work together, hopefully perfectly. So hopefully these are considered well-crafted vignettes. They're arranged roughly chronologically, starting with me getting taken home from the hospital as a baby. And then I wrote up to, just as far as, well, I'm 74 years old. So I brought it right up to now. That's the story. And, if you're curious about what happened in my life, you'll know an awful lot more about me by reading those 100 chapters. I might add that I left out all the nasty stuff, the disappointments, the heartbreak, the misbehavior, the maltreatment, the failures. All those I left out. It's all pretty upbeat.
So you doing the math. So 100 chapters, 100 words. That's what 10,000 words. So that's a good size novella. I think it came out to be like 100 and 20-something pages.
Something like that. Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
not sure. Just, yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
It's and it's $10. I mean, it's a bargain.
And did you self-publish this?
Well, Jim D. Filippi's company, Brown Fedora Books, published it.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And he was pretty much functioning as an editor, and he would cheer me on when I'd get stuck. The other thing about this book is that, let me see, why I just happen to have my own copy right here. And the other thing I would point out is that, flipping through, you can see there's a lot of like pictures.
Right.
If you're interested in seeing, pictures of me as a helpless, squalling infant, it's here. and if you're interested in seeing a picture of me as a crusty old curmudgeon, there I am. So it's just the life so far.
So that was gonna be my next question about the editing process for that. How, as you mentioned, you said Jim worked with you on editing that. How did that work? If he had to take something out, would he tell you to? Did he say, I took out 7 words, fill those back in and send it back? Or would he just refill them in with a different word?
Yeah. And sometimes he'd do it, he'd just find an alternate word. There really wasn't a lot of editing. I by the time I'd send something to him, I just poured over it almost endlessly. You'd be surprised how long it takes to write 100 100 words, to get a precise count of 100 words. And still, I'm not used to writing in short segments like that. I tend to go on. And so for me, it was a good exercise in restraint.
Did you, as you were writing this, did you ever get to a point where you were halfway through a story and thinking, this isn't going to be as good as I was hoping. Let me just scrap this and put in a new memory on something?
Yeah. And a lot of them I couldn't get down to 100 words and still, and they wouldn't have the kick I wanted them to have. So I had to eliminate those. There were a lot I just couldn't get right. And what I've decided to do is post some of those on Facebook.
Oh, okay.
In fact, I just posted one about the rapture. And
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah. And what you probably didn't do is count the words. There's like 211 words there. And I'm not sure I'm sure I could have cut it down some, but I don't know if I could slice it all the way down to 100 words.
Right.
But
how much, because some of the reviews on there talking about how there's just some really powerful messages of growing up in Vermont. How many of these were stories that you were looking at for the audience to read, or how many of these were stories that you just wanted to write down just to memorialize in a way for yourself?
Well, all of the above. A lot of these I never would have had an opportunity to tell if I hadn't written this little auto bio. And the more I delved into my own past, the more I discovered there was a real wellspring of information. I was sleeping with a notebook and a pen beside my bed because, in fact, I got special pens just for this task. They were pens with built-in flashlights.
Oh, cool.
So I didn't need to turn on a light. I could just flip on the light in the flashlight and make my notes. But I would, there's this weird transitional state when you're falling asleep or when you're waking up. And I would find that that little no man's land was when the memories would come.
Right.
But if I didn't write it down, I think falling asleep, I'd come up with a great idea. And I would say, this is such a great idea that there's no way I'm going to forget this. I'll just write it down in the morning. Sure. And in the morning it's gone.
All right.
So I got in the habit of making at least a couple of notes to remind myself the next day what I needed to write about. Um, it was an interesting process. I've never done anything quite like this before.
Right.
Fun. It was great fun. I'd like to live another 74 years so I can write another one.
What was your at first blush when you decided to do this project? How many memories were you able to write down in your first, like, notes of I'm going to do this one, this one? Did you have 20 right off the bat you knew you're going to do? Was it 40? Was it
Yeah,
more than
they came
100?
pretty fast at first.
Yeah.
And reading Jim's book, Jim wrote a book like this too. Here's Jim's book. Yeah, there he is. This is the first of the series, and reading his memories reminded me of things that had happened in my own life. And so I came away with an outline that was a useful tool to get started. I knew there were some things I simply had to talk about, big events in my life, like my father and mother, and I had to write enough about them to give people an idea of what they were like. But it was also important that it seemed to me it was important that I cover their deaths. So I had to have that in the book. And those are some of the, short, poignant chapters. But it was also, I wanted to talk about the time I was living in Italy, which never really comes up in conversation at all. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. And family, extended family, meeting family in Italy when I went. See, on my mother's side, I go back quite a ways as a Vermonter. But on my father's side, the Citros, my grandfather, my father's father, came here from Italy. And so I wanted to go back and find where he came from. My father still had some cousins there. My grandfather had a brother living there. And see, I wanted to meet all these people. I knew my Vermont grandfather, no problem, but
Right.
and he's in the book. But
and I don't know if this kind of goes against what Jim's premise was for the reason for the 100 words is, were you ever wanting to make a loophole and say, all right, I'm going to have a part 2 of this because this is more of a 200-word story?
Well, I could have done that. I could have done anything I wanted, but I thought it was, it's like, you have to obey the form.
Right. That's true.
I can't say, well, I'm going to write a sonnet, but mine's going to be 20 lines.
Yeah.
You can't do that. You gotta, but I was, I was thinking of writing a kind of a sequel in which I would include all the salacious, lurid, mean, and ugly stuff. I would call it plain brown wrapper. And just, all the stuff people want to be in this one and isn't. Right. So
right.
I probably won't do that.
Right. Now, what was the first story that was the first one as soon as you did this was the first story you wanted to tell that you wrote down?
Well, I wanted to talk about my third grandmother, my Aunt Ida, who was very influential when I was a little boy. She when my parents rented an apartment from her in Ludlow, Vermont. So when they took me home from the hospital, they took me to this apartment in her house. And she was, at that time, when I came home from the hospital as a little baby, she was 74 years old, my age now. And she was just a lovely old Vermonter. She taught me about the birds and the plants and the flowers, and would read to me just like a grandmother. And she was very influential, very, very influential. I wanted to remember her in this book. So I think she appears in if not the first, one of the very earliest chapters with a picture. There's a picture of me and her together. Interesting side note, but it's more her story than mine. She was the first person in the United States to ever receive a Social Security check.
Really?
Yeah. Uh,
Huh.
and, and I remember, she was a real old Vermont kind of Puritan woman. And, she taught Baptist Bible school, for example. And because of the secret she had, that she was the first person to have a Social Security check, they wanted her to go on this TV program called I've Got a Secret.
Oh, from the 1950s.
Do you remember that? And she didn't have a telephone. So I think they were using, we had a telephone, but she didn't have one. So when she was talking to them, she would come into our division of the house and carry on conversations with the people who were trying to book her for I've Got a Secret.
Hmm.
She found out that the program was sponsored by, Philip Morris or something like that, Marlboro's tobacco.
Right.
So she wouldn't do it.
Oh.
No. That was the end of that. I mean, she stuck to her principles.
Right. Yeah. So obviously, Joe, people know you as the ghost writer. You write a lot of ghost stories about New England and Vermont specifically. And last time you were on, you were talking about the book that was coming out called The Ghost Guide, A Second Conjuring. And was this a a remastering of a previous book?
Well, it's the Vermont Ghost Guide came out in the year 2000.
Okay.
And I wrote it, and Steve Bissett did the illustrations. Right. And he did some wonderful work in it. This is not exactly the best way to show this stuff, I guess, but he did some wonderful work in it, but he wasn't really available to pick up the expanded version.
Mm.
He's involved with other things, and I was talking to Robert about it, and I said I really wanted to do an expansion of it. Mm. And Robert was, willing to take over. And one of the more conspicuous, we added probably 30 something new stories.
Wow.
That weren't in the smaller edition.
Right.
And we expanded it in a number of ways. It's quite a bit bigger.
Right.
And Robert did an illustration for every story.
Wow.
It's amazing. The guy is so prolific and he's so good. And we worked together, and I wrote 30 new stories, and he did an illustration for every one, and the book is there for anyone who wants it. What we wanted to do was to kind of take a census of Vermont ghosts, and see what I've always wanted to do since I started writing was to chronicle as many of Vermont weird tales as I could. Nobody had ever done that. It's hard to believe, but in the history of our state, no single writer has ever devoted himself or herself to trying to collect the state's weird tales.
Right.
So as soon as I realized that, I also developed a sense of mission about it, and I decided I wanted to be the one to do that. I realized it's going to be impossible. Somebody's got to take over, but I can continue to consult via Ouija board for the next. But for now, I need somebody to pick up and carry on. But I sort of wanted to be the Abby Hemingway of scary right. stories. And
so let me ask you, Joe. Wait, since you've been doing this well on over 20 years, almost 30 years collecting these stories, do you have a lot of people who offer you up some legends and say, here's this? And when they do you do any like fact checking, not fact checking whether it's true or not, but whether it's a known folk story or
I do,
legend?
and I do, and there's some internal mechanism that tells me how much checking to do.
Mm,
Um, sometimes people try to fool me.
right.
They think, well, I'll make up a story and I'll tell it to him and he'll put it in one of his books. Usually I can catch that. Over the years, I've developed a pretty good, bullshit detector, and I can usually tell when someone's trying to put me on. There's a lot of stories that are good stories, but of questionable provenance. And if the story's good enough, I might write it anyway, but I'll say, well, there's no real reason to believe this, but so and so tells me that. There's a dinosaur running around up in Norton or something like that. Whatever it is, just because the story has a certain charm to it.
Right.
But I'm pretty careful to, some of the stories have been with us forever. The story about freezing the old people.
Right.
We can date that pretty accurately because the guy made that up and published it in the Montpelier newspaper. I guess it was in the late 1800s. And that is a story that started out as fiction, but kind of grew feet and took off on its own. And now there are people who believe that really happened. So Robert and I are in our new project. We're getting to the bottom of that. This comic book that he and I are writing may be the first of a series. I don't know. But it's what we're working on right now. Again, it's a pandemic project. It's something we can work on without going out into the field. We can send our characters out to the field because he and I are appearing in the comic. We are characters in the comic.
Right.
That's it. This is the first one, The Lair of the Beast. And as you can see, that's me and Robert down at the bottom, right below the crypto castle.
Right.
So yeah, that's maybe the cover, maybe not. We haven't really decided on a cover, but this is the working cover.
So talk to us about this then, Joe. Vermont Horror. So you're making a comic book series about infamous tales of terror from the Green Mountain State, and this is going to be in comic book form.
Yeah, and it's
Wow.
we're this is our project, and whether it has more than one issue, we don't know.
Right.
Could fall flat. There's always that possibility with any book, but if people like it and enjoy it and get a kick out of it, it's another way of preserving these stories.
Right.
And for us, we have the advantage of, we as we recount these stories to each other, we often find ourselves saying, well, wouldn't it be great if we could go back in time and sit in on one of the Eddie Brothers seances or something like that? And using the comic book form, well, we can do that. We can free flow through time, and we can, tour around the state without exposing ourselves to any COVID germs,
Right.
viruses rather. And so that's it. This first issue will have, I think, 5 stories, and I wrote them. Robert illustrated them, and they're going to be coming out as a comic. That's the plan.
And then before we went on the air, you were talking about how writing for writing a comic book script is different than normal prose. What are some of the things that you've had to adjust in your writing style when you're writing for a comic book?
That's a good question. I think it's a little like writing a movie script. And they have when they make movies, there's a screenplay, and then there's a storyboard. and they seem to be similar processes. I'm writing the screenplay. Robert's doing the storyboard. Here's what the storyboard might have looked like for the page you just see. It's not as developed. Right. What I have to do when I'm writing it is to picture the story as panels, and I also have to keep the verbiage down. So we're not talking 100 words now, like with the autobio. We're talking about 5 words, 10 words in the captions. We don't want a lot of writing,
right?
So there's kind of Robert is tremendously skilled at taking what I've written. See, I don't know how to write a comic script. I'm just kind of learning as I go, and he's very good at taking what I've written and doing the adaptation. He's much more experienced in the world of pictures than I am.
Right. So where do you sit on this when you're putting this together? Are you looking at what are some of the masthead folklore of Vermont that are going to grab the audience in right away? Or are you looking for stories that you haven't told yet that you feel might benefit from a different medium?
Well, again, all of the above. I don't know. I'm not sure if there are a lot of stories that I haven't told yet. I think there's only 1 or 2 in this comic that I've never told elsewhere. Okay. But I can bring different aspects of the story out.
Right.
Because I think if the readers are reading my prose, my longer books, they might be thinking, well, I wonder what that scene looks like. I wonder what it would be like if I were standing in front of that haunted house. And we can do that with a comic book, just like we could with a movie if we were wanted to lose our shirts on a movie.
Right. And how much is there any stories that you've told in a previous iteration, whether it be like your ghost guide, that might not be as powerful if it's visual, because then you're portraying how you want the ghost to look like, or you want the monster to look like, instead of the horror of the imagination of the reader?
That's a really good question. I think it doesn't. I may come up with a different answer to this if you ask me another time, but for now, I think that's more important in illustrating the novels, like Corey. I worked on Shadow Child with Corey Furman, and he provided something like 10 illustrations to go with a 300-page text. And we had to kind of work together to be sure he wasn't giving anything away that should be happening in the reader's imagination. I've been working with another artist on another novel who's illustrating another of my novels. And I felt it was important he probably knew this on his own, but it's one of those things the writer is obliged to say, and that is, don't show any pictures of the monster, because that's exactly what should be happening in the reader's imagination. The reader should picture the monster. You can show the monster's hand or paw, as the case may be, but just as a full-blown imagining of the monster, it would be a mistake. Let that happen. The reader and the writer are partners in a piece of fiction. They both bring something to it, and the writer just kind of puts the palette out there, and the reader fills it in.
Right.
It's an interesting process. With a comic book, that's not so important. I don't think that's so important. I think if you can show it, show it.
And plus you bring an illustrator to the table instead of, as you say, you have the reader and the writer. Now you have the illustrator who, and in some cases you want to make sure it's their, is it the illustrator's job to share the vision of the reader or share the vision of the writer?
Well, maybe his or her own vision. In this case, his. I'll continue to use his because I'm talking about Robert.
Right.
He. There's one monster in the book, and I described it a bit, and then Robert took over and put flesh on the bones, as it were. And so the reader will see what Robert created. They will imagine what Robert created. So,
right.
It's. I guess there are three partners involved in the comic. The writer, the illustrator, and the reader. We'll see. It's all an experiment, but it's a lot of fun. Robert's having fun with it.
Yeah, I'm surprised. So, because as I say, in the past 2 years, you are now working on. This is your 5th project.
Well, we did 2 maps.
Oh, that's right.
The Vermont Monster map. Then we did another map of ghosts.
Oh wow.
We did the Vermont Ghost Guide. We did the Vermont Ghost Experience. And God, is there something I'm forgetting? I think that's it. The comic book, which is published yet, but will be this year. That'll be out later this year. Robert has some target for that he wants. He wants to be ready by such and such a date when he's doing a convention.
Right. And as you'd mentioned, the Vermont Ghost Experience, which came out last year, that is the book that you, as you mentioned earlier, that you also did with Robert Brunelle Jr. I guess when it comes from a cryptozoological category, where do you see yourself as it comes to categorizations of, you got ghosts, you got monsters? Is there specific categories that through a Venn diagram perspective some of them cannot cross over when it comes to what you particularly like to collect as stories?
There's a couple words that are useful when we're talking about my canon. One is weird shit. Just anything that's weird. I like to explore and write about, and perhaps a more academic term might be Fortean studies, which is coined from a writer named Charles Fort, who was the first to collect in a serious way or semi-serious way. His writings are all pretty thoroughly tongue-in-cheek, but he was the first to catalog mysterious happenings.
Right. Did you, and because over the times, some of your previous work opened up towards New England, but some of your later work seems to refocus again in Vermont. Are you still looking at things that are in New Hampshire and Massachusetts and things like? Not anymore?
No, just Vermont. And as my focus gets more and more narrow, the potential number of readers also gets smaller.
Right.
But I as I said, I have a sense of mission about this, and I want to collect Vermont's tales. So that's all I'm doing now.
Right.
Recently, within the last couple of years, one of my New England books was just republished. That's Cursed in New England, which is a collection of stories about curses. And some of my other New England-based books are still in print, like Passing Strange, Tales of New Englanders, or I can't even remember what its title is, something like that. And what else? Well, Passing Strange and Cursed in New England. Oh, and Weird New England, that great big
Big book.
sized coffee table monstrosity of a book. Yeah, that's still in print.
Was there anything, I was always curious about this. Was there any story in there that you've collected that really made you say, there's something here? Like made you really like a pretty significant head scratcher for you?
Yeah, there's a few. Yeah, you can't do this and not run into one or two of those. Some are pretty easy to dismiss,
Right.
and those are not the ones you're asking about. You're asking about the ones that really caused me to think. There's one that's old, there's one that's new, and there's one that happened to me.
Mm.
The oldest one is the story of the Eddy brothers in Chittenden. Late 19th century, around 1876, these two brothers, William and Horatio Eddy, were conducting seances in their farmhouse in Chittenden, Vermont. And they were producing what appeared to be three-dimensional phantoms. And people were coming from all over the world to witness these phantoms in the hopes of seeing among them some deceased relative. And people would testify that they had met their father or met their great uncle or whatever. Some years ago, Vermont Life magazine invited me to do an article about the Eddy brothers, and my assignment was to try to debunk them.
Mm.
And that was challenging because I couldn't really debunk them. I could impeach them a little bit. I could cite examples of them being discovered in fraud, but I couldn't really definitely say that the seances were all fake.
Mm.
Because the phenomena were just too there were just too many weird things happened. These two guys couldn't have pulled it all off. It was just impossible. They had phantoms appearing that were from different countries and different nationalities, and they were speaking. One of the phantoms spoke in Russian to a Russian woman in the audience. Well, William and Horatio Eddy were barely literate.
Mm.
They had the English was a bit of a challenge for them. So where were they learning Russian? How did they fake that? There's so many examples of things that would have been tremendously hard for them to fake. So that's one that gives me pause. I think it also makes me realize that they were to some degree charlatans, but at the same time they might have been legit. Who knows?
Right.
So that's an old one. That in fact that's one of the things that got me into this in the beginning, just researching the Eddy brothers.
Okay.
A more modern story took place. I live in Windsor, birthplace of Vermont. That's where I am right now. I'm in a house that was built in 1786, and that's during that period of time when Vermont was an independent republic before we were even a state. I like that. Anyway, this should be a haunted house, but I know a number of people have died here, but they stay away. The ghosts stay away. But there's another house here in town where in the late 50s, 1957, I think it was, water started appearing inside the house. In the first person to notice it was one of the daughters named Janet, and she discovered water in the concave seat of a wooden chair in her room. And she cleaned it up, but other people were finding water elsewhere in the house. And I think in the first day they cleaned up something like 13 buckets full of water.
Wow.
But they couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And it kept happening. It started in October and lasted, I think, until December. And it got so bad that they had to leave the house. They would see water cascading down the stairs, and it would fill up plates and glasses and cups in the kitchen cabinet. And the guy, it was a medical doctor who owned the house, and he told one of the newspaper reporters that he had taken a plate full of grapes, a bowl full of grapes from the refrigerator. And by the time he got into the living room with this bowl of grapes, the bowl had filled with water. Just
wow.
Seriously. And the story has a lot of charm. It sounds like a typical poltergeist story because there were a couple of teenage daughters in the house. There was the doctor himself, who we can presume was sort of a scientific disposition, so he wouldn't be too quick to say it was a mystery. He'd say it must be coming from someplace. But he got a bunch of experts in the house, and including a plumber who shut the water to the house off, not at the main in the house itself, but at the street. And the house continued to fill with water. I talked to he had passed on, the plumber had passed on, but I talked to his wife, who was in her late 80s when I talked to her, and I've talked to her son, who's become a good friend of mine here in town. And they told me that the plumber was really baffled by this because, water wasn't behaving the way he learned it was supposed to. When he was getting his master's license, they didn't say anything about water just spontaneously appearing.
Right.
And apparently he was a strict Roman Catholic, and so there was something about this that was at odds with his religious experience. So it was very troubling for him.
Right.
So that's. Then the thing that happened to me, you'd think a lot of stuff would happen to me because I'm always putting myself in harm's way. Before the pandemic, I was doing things like spending the night by myself in allegedly haunted buildings and things like that. But the thing that happened that was really strange and hard to explain, and makes me think there's something else, happened when I was living in Burlington before I moved here to Windsor. I was alone in my house at night, and all of a sudden I heard this sort of high-pitched whining sound, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out what it was. I thought maybe a smoke alarm was going off or something like that. And so I got up and looked around, and there was no smoke alarm going off. And I thought, well, maybe it's a car alarm outside. So I walked over to the window, and opened the window and looked outside. No car alarm, but I could still hear this high-pitched keening sound. And as I walked by the kitchen, I could tell that that's where the sound was coming from, the kitchen. So I went into the kitchen. I'm not spooked yet. I'm still looking for the source of this. And I had left, I'm not the tidiest person in the world, and I had left a lot of dirty dishes on the countertop. And I hadn't started the dishwasher, so it wasn't that. And as I looked, I saw that one of the dishes, it was a glass. It was a French tumbler. And it was spinning really fast. And I couldn't believe it. I just stared at it, and it was spinning faster than you can imagine. I mean, faster than you could spin it. Right. I tried afterwards to spin it that fast. There's just nothing. You can't spin it that fast. It was spinning so fast, and it was making the noise.
Oh wow!
And while I was looking at it, get this. While I was looking at it, it exploded.
Whoa!
Now, people tend not to believe this story, Um, my neighbor was a scientist, is a scientist. He's still employed as a scientist, and he and I knew each other well enough so that when I took the story to him, he knew I wasn't fabricating the story. He knew I was reporting it as accurately as I could, and he knew me well enough to know that I wasn't trying to put him on. So he explained to me that, you know, the whole problem with this stuff is that it's not repeatable. Things happen like this,
Right.
but you can't get them to happen again. And so they elude the scientific method because they're not repeatable. And that nothing like that had ever happened to me before. Nothing like that has happened to me since. And I've tried to spin
Right.
glasses, and I can't even get them to spin. I mean, I can't get them to spin that fast. I can't get them to spin. I mean, it was right up on its edge, like that sort of. So it was the strangest thing, and no one has ever offered any explanation. It was like, you remember those old TV commercials where they have an opera singer,
and then the glass would break.
Yeah. It was kind of like that. Like there was some focused sound on it, but where that sound was coming from, I think there's only one answer, Barney. Aliens.
It's got to be.
Yeah, it's the strangest thing, and I've mentioned that a lot. I used to not mention it.
Right.
And then I started mentioning it when I was speaking to groups in hopes of finding somebody else who had some experience like
right. Huh. Wow. Well, so Joe, we're at the top of our hour already. So congratulations again on your newest book, and excited to see your comic book to be coming out. That's really exciting. And if people want to read some of your books, where's the best way that people can get a hold of your books?
Well, probably Amazon. I hate to keep saying Amazon. I'd rather be able to send them to local stores, but a lot of local stores just aren't carrying my stuff. And the new one, Loose Ends, the autobiography, is only available through Amazon. It's a special exclusive deal between the publisher and Amazon Books. It's available worldwide, but just through Amazon.
Okay.
So that's it. But $10, you know, you can't go wrong.
You can't go
Especially
wrong with that.
Time. You don't even have to pay for the shipping.
Right. See? Right. That's right. Well, thank you so much, Joe. And you got to come back on when your comic book comes out.
Maybe we could come on together. Me and Robert.
You and Robert. We'll get you both on. Yeah, that'd be great.
Fun. Yeah. And you'll be speaking to him soon, so say hi.
Yep, I sure will.
It's just fun.
Thank you.